Welcome, I'm Peter Shergold, the head of the Centre for Social Impact, and welcome to Yakety Yak, our first for 2011. Tonight I think is going to be very special. Football, or soccer as it's often known in Australia, is a wonderful game. I have followed it since my father took me the first time 57 years ago, and there still isn't a Sunday morning when I don't wake up and look to see how Portsmouth FC, Pompey, are doing in the Champions League. Our guest for this evening's Yakety Yak, I am certain, shares my love of soccer. But he also saw that it could be something more than a game. It could be an inspiration and a focus, particularly for those most disadvantaged Australians, the homeless. And so he got involved in creating the homeless soccer competition in Melbourne, and then, most importantly, it was his efforts that brought the 2008 Homeless World Cup to Melbourne. We're going to discover that, and I suspect much more, about our evening's guest, who is George Halkias. And, as always, as our interlocutor to find out more about George, Peter Thompson. Please welcome George and Peter.
George, welcome along.
Good to be here.
In 2009 in Milan, Australia didn't win, but actually got a Fairest Award.
Well, looking at my coaching history in Homeless World Cups, we don't win that often. I think we've come 43rd on 3 occasions, but what we do win is in the true spirit of the competition, and winning that Fair Play Award in Milan in 2009 for me was the pinnacle of what we aim to achieve at each of the events. It's about representing your country with distinction, it's about your conduct, it's about how you work as a team, and it's recognised by the different countries' coaches, and so to receive that in 2009 was a pretty proud achievement for all of us, and to be honest, it wasn't that easy. The first game we played, I recall, against Portugal, I think we copped a good shellacking, 20 goals to 1, because games go for 14
That's
minutes.
That's not close, I presume.
No, that is... There are more goals scored in this small-sided game, but look, the score was immaterial in this game because our attitude really stunk, and our players were, showing disrespect to the referees, to some of their teammates, to some of their opponents, and I was a pretty upset coach. And after the game, I recall we gathered as a team, and I said, "Follow me," and we walked through the streets of Milan for about 10k. I think it was the endless walk of disappointment and shame, but pretty much brought the team together and said, let's have a think about what we did out there. Can we turn it around? And the good thing is you play 15 odd games during that tournament, and that game was, the next game we played was the antithesis of that, and our players showed great sportsmanship, respect to the referees, and turned it around, and to get that award was a proud achievement for them.
Let's go back to 2005 when this began on Fitzroy Street, didn't it?
In Fitzroy, just in the Atherton Gardens, one of the public housing estates there. It goes back a while.
How many came that first day?
Just a couple. Pretty inauspicious beginning. It was a pretty wet day, I recall, and
that'd be typical.
Back then when it rained, and it stopped raining and now it rains again, but pretty much there was a couple of vendors, being at the big issue organisation. A couple of the vendors were lukewarm about coming, and we had to bribe them with a couple of magazines that they could sell. So they came down, and they had a ball, but we had more volunteers there than what we did players, and we weren't quite sure where it would take off, looking at what the barriers are for sport, for people experiencing so many challenges in their life. Are they interested in sport? Have they got too many other challenges in life? Do they enjoy the round ball, or do they like a different code? Did they have the fitness and well-being to play sport? All those things were answered, and on that given day, I recall those two players had a ball and had a great time, but towards the end, there was a young fellow by the name of Yusuf who came along, barefoot, shorts, and he was coming back from Centrelink or something, and saw that we'd milled around after the game, and we had all our soccer balls packed under a tree, and came and asked what was happening. And I said, well, essentially we were getting together once a week to have a kick and have a bit of fun. And he said, I'll be back next week, and I'll bring a few of my mates down from one of the hostels, one of the crisis hostels, and it was quite scary because he was barefoot and we were playing in public housing estate in which there were a few syringes flying around, but he hit the ball with tremendous power and he had this love of the game, and that's how it grew. I mean, I think until he arrived, we probably thought we were in a bit of trouble.
Well, that same year you went to Edinburgh, didn't you?
Yes, indeed.
So that's a big leap from having two people come to an event to actually taking a team to Edinburgh.
Oh, yes, indeed. That was an amazing journey of trying to get such a project up. I mean, initially we really just got the program going and established the weekly training. So for 2 hours, the players would come and enjoy, you know, the camaraderie, the sport, the support of a coach who, in my case, was a psychologist, but they didn't know that because I was wearing my shorts and my runners. And there was a great spirit amongst the group, and we formed our own little community. It was the one thing that they looked forward to, you know, the one constant in their crappy week. You know, the night before, that anecdotally they'd say they wouldn't take drugs or drink because they wanted to be fit and ready to go. And then after the session, I'd wear them out, so they were pretty wrecked, so they couldn't get into too much trouble.
That night?
Yeah, that's it. So, but we started doing a few extra things like going on camps or going to the footy or going to the movies, and created our own little community and supporting each other, peer support, critical thing I always believe in. And I mean, that was going really well, and we could see the change in attitude in the players. But I guess, as you mentioned, there was that objective of sending a team to Edinburgh in 2005, and as you might imagine, the practicalities and logistics of it are massive, and just to start off to get some funding to get some tickets over there, and we knocked on so many doors. And I guess back then the program was unknown worldwide and also within the country, and also there was enormous risk associated with it. The Big Issue organisation itself was pretty fledgling and, you know, developing. So it was, again, looking a little bit grim, but if I can mention one individual who was instrumental in getting us to Edinburgh, we were on ABC State Line TV show. They came to do a little bit of footage and maybe a subtle little nudge to try and get some funding, and a gentleman by the name of Ray Horsburgh, who was then at Smorgon and Steel and chairman of Essendon Footy Club, a different code, and he sent us a cheque, no questions asked, on the Monday. So didn't have to continue doing all those submissions and knocking on corporate doors, and that was a catalyst really for us to get a little bit more help and send a team over to Edinburgh. But that was only where the work began.
Well, after Edinburgh, you went to Cape Town and then Copenhagen, and then somehow you managed to convince the various authorities, because you needed their cooperation, to bring this to Melbourne in 2008.
Yeah.
I know they can't win the other World Cup.
No. Could have used me as a consultant, but
they didn't?
That's a story. No, they should they? But that was a story in itself. In that, when we came back, all of a sudden, people were interested in our program. They could see the benefits of it. They could understand the benefits of it, and we were getting calls from community agencies across the country and different councils who wanted to run the program in different municipalities and Indigenous communities and local governments. And all of a sudden, people were actually interested in us and coming to us. And we thought about, at the same time, they were actually taking bids for future Homeless World Cups. And we thought perhaps we could use the bidding process to make a few friends and get a bit of support to maybe expand the program. Just like the Big Issue magazine, which is sold across the country. Maybe our program that's running in Fitzroy could be expanded across the country. And so, yeah, we made friends with some people in high places, particularly a friend in the Melbourne Major Events Company who, I guess just out of a love of the game and an interest in helping the community, decided to hold our hands through this bidding process. And we started to put it together. We got support from state, federal, local governments. A number of different corporate organisations pledged their support and financial support. And we put a compelling argument and proposal to them. And it was, 5 years ago or so, before the Big Issue's 10th anniversary, that we were announced as the successful bidders for the 2008 Homeless World Cup.
Now, there's something about sport, as Peter was saying, that sort of brings people together, but there's also, sport is the vehicle, but there's many other things that hang off that in terms of community support and outreach, and just explain some of those things, how it works.
Well, essentially, as I mentioned, we've created our own little community, our own little family. For many of the players living in social isolation, you know, don't have anything positive, don't have any support out there, and the street soccer became their own community and family. And most of the players would get there, you know, an hour, half an hour before training would begin, or they'd follow me to the office. And it was something that really got them going and motivated them and gave them some impetus. And there was the discipline behind that. There was the structure of listening to a coach, taking direction. There was the referral and information that I could give them about support services or about their health and well-being. There was working as a team, all those sort of things that perhaps they hadn't done before, but also about self-esteem and self-confidence. In terms of their health, I often laugh. We used to run a lap and have the obligatory cigarette, and then we tried to work on that, so it was 2 laps and then a cigarette. But that was a sense of achievement because you're building from a low base, and just to turn up to training for some people, facing mental illness and severe depression, just to get out of bed and get to training, get on a tram or just motivate yourself to get to training is amazing. And their fitness levels are poor necessarily, or just lacking in motivation, but we chip away, and I guess we create a culture. We create a culture of improving ourselves, about looking after each other, about developing ourselves as citizens and in our own community. And I guess then what we did is, we didn't want a program where our individual participants were isolated. Homeless people were isolated enough. We started to bring in other people to the program to make it representative of the wider community and let them rub shoulders and learn from each other. Because stereotypes both ways. Homeless people have stereotypes sometimes of the wider community. Others might have stereotypes of homeless people. And so we started having some challenge games or just having it a bit of fun, and I invited a few corporates, BHP are neighbours to the big issue. And they came down and I just saw the positives that had for the players, that they were rubbing shoulders with engineers and managers and IT managers. And they were talking about the same things. They were talking about losing weight, they were talking about cars, they were talking about favourite holiday destinations. And so they had more in common than what differentiated themselves. So, sport has that power to bring people together. And when you're wearing your sports gear or you're out there on the pitch, you don't know who's homeless and who isn't. You're all equal, and pretty much that's how our society should be.
You've always loved the roundball game, haven't you?
Oh, I've loved it. I've loved all sports.
I can tell.
Can you tell? But I loved all my sports. I used to eat, breathe and sleep it. Much to the chagrin of my parents, who were really espousing education, coming from a primitive Greek village in which they didn't get much formal education. They were really pushing it, and I used to have different coaches knock on our door and say, "We'd really love your son to come and play in our club." And Dad would say, "Nope, he's got Greek school on Saturday," and I'd be just... So he'd be killing me. So I always had a dream of representing my country. And I guess I did that in a pretty amazing and complex way. But the roundball is a beautiful game. It often gets I draw the analogy sometimes to homeless and marginalised people, because it gets maligned, it gets kicked in the teeth. People bag it for being violent. People bag it for all sorts of things. But it's great, just like all sports. And I love all sport, and sometimes I like to stick up for the underdog. So as well as homeless people, I often stick up for the roundball, because I know what a beautiful game it is, and it's played all over the world.
These parents of yours came from Greece in the 60s, and life was tough. Your mother worked as a machinist for 20 years.
Yeah.
And your dad did various labouring jobs, but had an industrial accident.
He did.
And,
yep.
and when you asked the question, where did George come from? Those experiences were obviously quite significant for you.
Oh, they were great experiences, and I cherish those moments, and they've made me the person that I am. My mum was a pillar of strength to our community and our family. Whenever anything went wrong, she really stood tall. So I think, got a lot from the way she stood tall, and the compassion that she showed for people who were suffering or people in difficult situations.
Well, she'd make special effort to look after newcomers.
Very much, very much. And our own Greek community, church community, they were active in that community as well. But Mum worked for 20 years as a machinist, catching a train to Richmond morning and night, and after 20 years she lost her long service leave because they went under back then when all those sort of things happened. So Dad was working in labouring jobs, and they often talk about the European backs and that, but if you saw how hard he worked, you could understand why that happened. So Mum had to pretty much support us as well. So
you and your younger sister Maddie, right?
My sister Maddie, yeah, she was 3 years older than me.
Right.
So they were great times. I reflect on my childhood and with great fondness, but in many ways I was also an interpreter and translator for my parents, because their English was limited, and they'd take me along to their doctor's appointments and believe it or not, with my sister, she'd go to my parent-teacher interviews and I'd go to her parent-teacher interviews. So if we ever had any niggles or something, you know, we'd probably, you know, embellish the truth a bit to get each other into trouble. But so there was a sense of responsibility too to that. You know, you had to grow up a bit quicker. You had to, and we had to look after each other.
What did they want for you?
Oh, they wanted me to study and get a degree and get a decent job.
Well, you did that.
I did that. I ended up doing a science degree, which pretty much...
Organic and inorganic chemistry.
Yeah, it almost killed me, but...
Sounds exciting.
Well, when I mean it almost killed me, if you'd seen what I was doing in those labs, I don't know what I was mixing. But, yeah, look, I discovered the discipline of psychology, which, you know, as we all know, is of great interest to me.
And that was after your science degree?
Well, as part of my science degree, I didn't finish the inorganic and organic and majored in psychology and did postgraduate studies where I started having an interest in human behaviour and human cognition and helping people. So, you know, I was talking about it a bit earlier that back then we didn't get a lot of careers advice and I probably wasn't exposed to the different careers out there. And science degree, I was really just keen to get a degree and you know, fulfil that ambition and for my parents as well in some ways.
So looking for a job,
Mm-hmm.
one comes up in the public housing estate. That was the start.
It was, and I mean, I'd done my postgraduate psych qualifications and I was interested in a counselling role or something in that area, and I get a role as a housing officer supporting people who, I guess, experienced homelessness, mental illness, substance abuse, domestic violence, and were being housed and supported in government housing. And it was the best apprenticeship that you could imagine because you're exposed to all those different facets of helping people. Indigenous people being housed, people literally moving forward, I guess, from all those different challenges. And I think it was probably the best training I could have ever had.
And from there you go to the Victims Referral Service. Yeah,
the Department of Justice, where I go to manage a service for victims of crime, which was ironic. About a week before I had a bit of an incident, and the public housing estate was not always the safest place, and I almost became a victim of crime. I remember the week before, which was quite scary, but it was probably, again, gave me a really good understanding of, you know, people who have been victimised, some of the fear and trauma that they go through.
What happened to you?
Basically threatened. I was actually supporting a client whose tenancy had ended and the house was being ransacked, and I went to change the locks and ensure no damage was done. One of her family members thought that I was evicting her and started threatening me, but it all, through negotiation, cleared up, and yeah, went to Victims Referral for another 6 great years. Great learning and helping lots of people again.
In a way, when you look back in retrospect, you sort of see things that you didn't see at the time. What did you feel about working in the system?
Look, initially it was a bit of a culture shock to me, even though I was keen to, and I'd learnt about psychology and I loved helping people, but for me to see some of the issues that people were facing, and you know, homelessness and the mental illness and the poverty and all those challenges, and I'd go to my lovely warm house in Glen Iris and get well looked after by my mum and dad, and yeah, it would touch a nerve, to be honest. And when I was younger, it really hit home how lucky I was, but it took me a little while to sort of get a perspective of it and come to terms with it.
Well, people take on careers like that because they want to make a difference. I think everybody wants to make a difference. Yeah. I mean, did you feel like you could make a difference?
Very much, very much. And obviously I had my psych background and had my training in that area, but placing people in housing is such a major thing. It's not just giving people a roof over their head, and that's how it sort of it evolved with the soccer as well, that people need to do, you know, as well as putting a roof over people's head, they need to work, they need to study, they need support for the various issues that they're facing. They need to feel part of society, they need a sense of purpose, a sense of belonging. So I started to pick that up pretty early, I think, in those days in housing.
As you were saying, it was fairly early days for The Big Issue. And The Big Issue is part of a network of 90 such newspapers around the world, Indeed. Street newspapers. Was their initiative to start the Homeless World Cup. But let's go back to that moment you took the leap from the public sector to the social sector, and you took on a job as circulation manager for regional Victoria.
Yeah, it was interesting that I'd been an avid reader of the magazine and I knew about it, and I guess having worked in government service, we used to fund community agencies to provide practical support and other supports, and I was pretty interested in moving into the community sector and getting my hands a little bit dirtier, and took on a role there to expand the magazine to regional Victoria. Magazines are sold in capital cities, and obviously people identify homelessness and disadvantage quite often, mainly in inner cities where it's sometimes more visible, but it occurs in regional areas as well. And so came to the big issue to expand it to Ballarat, Geelong, Bendigo, that sort of thing. And I was pretty excited. An organisation like the Big Issue interested me, and I mean, I remember having my interview in a house that right next to Wesley Church there that has to be seen to be believed. It's pretty primitive, but it's such a great location, and you know, if anybody's seen the Young Ones, it looked like the house in the Young Ones. And I thought, what am I getting myself into? Because we've gone from these government plush offices to the community sector, but I haven't regretted it one bit.
How many copies does the Big Issue sell?
It can vary between 15 to 20,000 a fortnight. Depends on a whole range of things about the generosity of people, the weather, what's on the cover. Christmas can be a positive time, but it's such a great example of a social enterprise, and for me, vendors selling the magazine on city streets are true heroes, true Australian heroes. To put yourself out there, wear a vest or uniform that says you're homeless or you have, you know, a range of issues, but to get out there in the cold or the heat and to wait hours upon hours to try sell a magazine, to me that takes enormous courage. So I felt great privilege to be part of that network, and at that organisation, the staff, the vendors, the soccer players, we're all one big family, and we all look after each other, and we feel like our own Big Issue community.
And globally, there are scores of these newspapers that are actually linked formally.
Yes,
with the network.
It's what's called the International Network of Street Papers, and it's amazing. They get together annually to talk about ways to sell more magazines.
And they sell millions.
They do. It would be literally millions. There are so many across the globe, and I was very fortunate last year. I facilitated the conference that it took place in Melbourne. We had 60 odd of those representative organisations come to Melbourne, and the passion of those people and coming from different organisations and the learning that takes place, and not surprisingly, that's where the Homeless World Cup evolved, where, well, the legend has it took place in a bar where they were drinking and talking about why none of their vendors or the people that they worked with were at their annual International Network of Street Paper conference. And I think one individual said, well, even if we had them here, they couldn't speak the same language. The one language that they could speak was that of football. And so that's how the Homeless World Cup began, because they started talking about each of these organisations running a sports or soccer program to help their vendors in that way, and then coming together and playing in an annual tournament. So from small things.
Now, talking about that, let's talk about how the game has actually expanded through, the network has expanded through Australia. You've actually were good enough to take the red-eye plane back from Perth last night so that you knew you wouldn't miss tonight. Yeah. And you were there as part of spreading the network. There are now 30 groups, aren't there,
around
throughout Australia? 30
programs. And look, when we bid for the Homeless World Cup, I mentioned earlier, to bring it to Melbourne, our vision was to expand the program around the country. And we wanted the event itself in Melbourne to leave a legacy of these programs, and that's what's taken place with the support of a number of corporate supporters, but particularly the federal government. We've been able to expand what we began in Melbourne 5 years ago in Fitzroy to 30 locations, which is capital cities, regional areas, and also some Indigenous communities. So that dream was realised, and yeah, the program's now more sophisticated. We do a number of different events. My role's changed a little bit. I mentor all the coaches around the country, continue to develop the program and look at ways that we can help our clients better, our participants better, and just, I guess, try and continue developing the culture of the program. And
in August, you're going to Paris?
We hope so, yep. We're looking to...
As coach?
As coach, yep.
And mentor?
Coach and mentor. Yeah, well, I guess that's the role, isn't it? As well as trying to maybe kick a few goals and win a few matches, it's really about going over there, representing your country with distinction, making the most of the experience, because, you know, you can win that trophy, that Homeless World Cup trophy, but if you haven't used it and learnt it and learnt anything from the experience, then it's useless. So for mine, whether you come first or last is irrelevant. It's how you use the Homeless World Cup to move forward, to start to dream again, and change your outlook in life. And I've been very privileged to have been to 5 events, and they've all been unique and great experiences, but I've made enormous friends around the world as well.
George, it's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks for the opportunity.